Dr. Kelvin had the looks, the money, and the kind of charm that could light up any room. A brilliant surgeon with a reputation for both saving lives and breaking hearts. He lived life on his own terms. Fast, lavish, and untouchable. But one night, over drinks with his two closest friends, a challenge was placed on the table. One that was meant to test more than just his charm. It seemed simple at first, just another game to feed his ego and prove a point. But the woman at the center of it all was nothing like the others he had conquered before. She was quiet, guarded, and carried an air of mystery that even his smoothest lines couldn't easily penetrate. What Dr. Kelvin didn't know was that this game would pull him into a world where every move had consequences, and one secret could change everything he thought he knew about winning. Welcome to the Judge Stories, where love, ambition, and hidden truths collide. If you enjoy stories that keep you guessing until the very end, stay tuned. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a twist. The polished glass doors of St. Gregory Medical Center hissed open, letting in the crisp scent of disinfectant and the soft hum of the hospital's central air. Dr. Kelvin stepped through the corridor like he owned the place. His navy blue scrubs perfectly fitted, a Rolex gleaming beneath his sleeve, and that trademark smirk playing on his lips. Nurses turned to look as he passed. Some smiled shyly, others rolled their eyes. Everyone knew Kelvin's type. Rich, brilliant, charming, and trouble if you didn't guard your heart. He wasn't just a surgeon. He was the surgeon patients requested by name, the one featured in glossy medical journals for innovative procedures, the one seen pulling up to the hospital in a silver Maserati that purred like it knew it was expensive. And yet, for all his skill with a scalpel, Kelvin's reputation outside the operating room was defined by whispers and knowing glances. A womanizer, a player, the kind of man who could make you feel like the only person in the world, until he didn't. As he strode toward the private wing, Kelvin's gaze flicked, for perhaps the 10th time this week, to the far corner of the main waiting area. There she was again. Same quiet posture, same neat wrapper over her legs, wheelchair positioned near the window where the morning sun streamed in. She sat with a paperback in her lap, the kind of romance novel that looked well-loved and worn at the edges. Her hair was tied back in a soft bun, revealing faint surgical scars near her jawline. The perpetual patient, Kelvin thought. He'd seen her enough times to know her face, but not her story. Always alone, always calm. She wasn't like the chatty relatives pacing the corridors or the worried patients staring at their charts. No, she seemed to belong and yet be out of place, like a piece of furniture no one noticed until they looked closely. Kelvin's two closest friends, Dr. Femi and Dr. Tund, noticed her too, and they had their own opinions. Still here, Femi muttered as they walked toward the staff lounge. His tone dipped in curiosity. What's her deal? She's not on any of my patient lists. Tund shrugged. Probably some long-term case. She's always around, maybe waiting for a donor match, maybe follow-up appointments. Who knows? But she's definitely not here for just a cold. Kelvin smirked. Maybe she just likes hospital food. Femi laughed under his breath. Or maybe she's one of those women who's too cautious. Even if you walked over there right now, she'd probably think you're after something. The conversation might have ended there, but Femi's next words planted a seed that would grow into something dangerous. You know, he said slowly, leaning back in the lounge chair, if you can get her to fall for you, I believe your charm is truly unmatched. It started as banter, but over the next few days, it became something else. They were planning Female Chelsea, the state-of-the-art women's hospital that would be their crowning achievement. Ownership shares have been a sticking point in every meeting. Femi and Tund each wanted a safe 30%, leaving Kelvin with 40% if, and only if, he could pull off the impossible. And Adora, the quiet woman in the wheelchair, became their test. She's not the kind of woman to fall for your smooth lines, Tund said one evening over drinks. If you succeed, you deserve that 40%. His smile was sly. The next morning, Kelvin found himself standing in the same waiting room corner he'd only glanced at before. Up close, Adora's presence was different. She looked up from her book, her eyes a deep, steady brown that didn't widen at his approach. No flicker of recognition. No fluster. "Ah," Kelvin said smoothly. "I'm Kelvin. Dr. Kelvin." She studied him for a moment, as if weighing the value of even replying. "Adora," she said simply. The silence stretched. Kelvin, used to easy openings, felt something rare, uncertainty. He gestured toward her book. "Romance." She gave the faintest smile. "Something to pass the time." "Long wait." "Always," she replied, her voice calm but layered with something he couldn't quite name. It was the first conversation of many. Kelvin walked away that day with something he hadn't expected. Not her phone number, not a date, but an itch of curiosity. And for a man like Kelvin, curiosity was dangerous. In the corridors of St. Gregory, a game had begun, but neither player knew the other's full hand. Night draped itself over Lagos like a velvet curtain, the city blinking with 1,000 restless lights. From the rooftop of Eco Meridian Towers, the lagoon looked like poured ink cut by the red-eye trails of traffic on the bridge. A soft breeze lifted linen napkins, and the low throb of Afrobeats from a hidden speaker stitched the evening together. At a corner table, 3 men leaned over tumblers of single malt, the glow from a brass hurricane lamp throwing small gold fires in their eyes. Dr. Kelvin lounged back, blazer unbuttoned, shirt open at the throat, the relaxed ease of a man who knew rooms bent to him. Across from him, Dr. Femi, sharp cheekbones, sharper tongue, tapped a pen against a leather folder labeled Female Chelsea. Beside Femi, Dr. Tund wore the steady patience of a man who always did the math twice and the sutures once. He was the spine of their trio, the one who made ambition look like caution. "Last page," Femi said, flipping the folder open. "Projected cash flow after year 2. Prenatal, GYN-onc, fertility lab, rehab suites, the whole dream. 40 beds to start. We scale to 80. Where I come from," Tun murmured, "dreams eat money for breakfast." Kelvin smirked. "Relax, accountant in scrubs. We're not short on investors. We're short on nerve." Femi rolled the pen between his fingers. "Which brings us to ownership. We can keep arguing percentages until the jollof goes cold, or we can test the man who insists he's inevitable." Kelvin's eyes narrowed. "You're still on that?" "I'm still on facts," Femi said. "You play games and win. Every time. But this," he tilted his chin, as if pointing through the skyline to the hospital miles away. "This isn't a dance floor. It's a foundation." Tun slid a document across the table, their latest draft MOU. 30, 30, 40. But the 40 is performance-based. He paused, let the phrase hang. And the performance isn't a spreadsheet. Kelvin lifted his glass, not drinking. "Say it." The woman in the waiting room, Femi, said simply, "Adora." The knight took a slow breath. Kelvin had expected it. He still felt a flicker of annoyance. "She's not a metric," he said. "She's a mirror," Tund replied. "You said it yourself. Female Chelsea isn't just medicine. It's trust. It's convincing women who have been failed by a system to believe again. If your charm is so surgical, persuade the one woman who won't be impressed." Kelvin's laugh was easy. It wasn't careless. "You want me to date a stranger to prove I can run a hospital? We want you to be serious about something that isn't already enamored with you," Femi said. "Adora is not simple. She's guarded. She reads people like charts. She looks beyond the theater lights and shiny machines. You make her choose you freely, and I'll believe you can lead a place built on vulnerability. And if I don't," Kelvin asked. "You keep 30%, Tun said, steady as a metronome. "We split the top." Kelvin let the silence stretch, let the breeze do its small work, let the city murmur around them. Behind his eyes, fragments formed. Adora's calm gaze over a paperback, the faint scars crossing the soft line of her jaw, the way she did not scramble to fill silence. He felt again the unusual sensation he'd had in front of her, uncertainty, and it prickled like a challenge pressed to skin. "What's the time frame?" he asked finally. Femi's smile was a blade. "No dragging. If this is real, it's real. Win her heart. Wear a hand. We'll accept a 3-month marriage minimum for the purpose of the clause. You both can decide your life afterwards." But the proof of concept is commitment. Kelvin's jaw ticked. You're making marriage a milestone in a deck. Marriage was a milestone long before pitch decks, Tun said. Then, gentler, we're not joking about her. We're serious about you. The pen stopped rolling. The lamp hummed. Somewhere below, the elevator chimed like a soft bell. Kelvin took a slow sip and met the eyes of the men who had stitched themselves to his future through resident nights and emergency codes and celebratory breakfasts at dawn. They knew him. They knew his strengths. They knew his shortcuts. He set the glass down. Defined terms. Femi slid a single page, an addendum, to the table. The language was clean, the kind that looked harmless until it owned you. Clause 7.1. Upon satisfactory evidence of marriage entered into with Ms. full legal name to be appended. Such marriage having persisted for not less than 90 consecutive days, the undersigned party shall, within 5 days of verification, cede an additional 10% equity to Dr. K. Aluko, bringing his total to 40%. Kelvin scanned it, then set the paper flat with his palm. And if she refuses me outright, then the test is passed by failing, Femi said. You don't coerce. You don't beg. You attempt with sincerity. If you manipulate, we will know. If you rush her, we will know. If you lie, he let it taper. We walked, Tun finished. Kelvin bristled at manipulate. The word didn't fit the story he told himself about himself. So you want honesty and patience from the man you keep calling a playboy. We want a leader, Tun said, and lifted his glass. To female Chelsea. Femi lifted his. Kelvin hesitated, then touched crystal to crystal. The chime was clear, small as a secret. Sealed, Femi said. Sealed, Tun echoed. Kelvin said nothing. He drank. The next morning, the hospital woke in its usual staccato rhythm. Crash carts and clipboards, the espresso huddle at the nurse's station, the elevator doors that opened like hymns and swallowed prayers. Kelvin's scrub jacket hung perfectly across his shoulders. He had shaved too close and smelled faintly of cedar. His steps, normally conducted by confidence alone, were now scored by intention. He told himself this wasn't a script. He told himself scripts didn't make his pulse pick up. When he reached the main waiting area, Adora was there, by the window, like a constant in an equation he'd only just learned to respect. Today she wore a simple cream blouse with a shawl draped across her shoulders, its ankara patterned soft, almost shy. The wheelchair sat at its familiar angle, a leather satchel hooked to the side, the paperback replaced by a notebook. She was writing. Morning, he said, and let the word be ordinary. Her eyes lifted. They always met his calmly, like still water that hid depth. Doctor, he smiled. Kelvin, please. Kelvin, she repeated, as if trying to sound for weight. You're early. I could say the same, he offered. She closed the notebook and slid a pen into its spiral. Hospitals don't fit into people's clocks, Kelvin. We adjust. True, he said. We steal our peace between alarms. He nodded at the notebook. You journal? Sometimes. A beat. You? He chuckled. Only when I need to lie to myself convincingly. One eyebrow flicked. Something like amusement lit the edges of her mouth. Honesty before noon. That's rare. Then let me risk a second truth, he said. If you ever get tired of bad cafeteria coffee, I know a place across the street with espresso that could make a cynic sing. She considered him, the pause just long enough to be a choice. Today, I can't. Another time, then, he said and didn't push. May I wheel you to the window? The sun's acting like it owns the place. She arched her head toward the glass. Yes, more light. And he moved behind the chair, fingers finding the handles. He matched her pace when she lifted a hand, slower. The simple choreography of consent. At the window, the city spilled itself below them. Okadas weaving, a hawker lifting a crate of water to his shoulder, a mother adjusting a toddler's backpack. Adora watched, her gaze softening in a way that made Kelvin suddenly aware of the ridiculous importance of the next sentence. Do you ever get bored of hospitals? He asked, voice careful. Not of healing, of halls. She let the question pass through her like light, then answered without flinch. I learned a long time ago that some places that break you become the same places that teach you to stand again, even if standing looks different. Kelvin's hand tightened imperceptibly on the chair. He didn't look at her scars. He didn't ask what, when, how many times. His body had stitched enough people to know that pain resents curiosity it hasn't invited. Standing, he echoed. Different is still standing. A nurse appeared, smiling apologetically. Ms. Adora, physiotherapy will see you in 15. Adora nodded her thanks. The nurse retreated. Kelvin took the cue and stepped back. I'll let you prepare. She folded her notebook into the satchel. Thank you for the window, she said. Anytime, he said, a minute more than he expected. By late afternoon, the rhythm of rounds had scrubbed the edges off purpose, leaving the day honest and tired. Kelvin finished stitching a tidy 6-centimeter line along a teenager's forearm, praised the patience of a 10-year-old with a cast, signed off on a discharge, and lost a small argument with a vending machine. He should have felt like himself again, competent, buoyant. Instead, the rooftop conversation kept returning like a bass line. He found Femi between cases, peering at scans on a lightboard. I'm not turning this into theater, Kelvin said without preface. There won't be tricks. Femi slid his eyes from bone shadow to friend. Good. Also, Kelvin added, no one mentions the bed again. Not to me. Not to her. Not anywhere. Femi's mouth curled. You think I'm reckless? I'm not. I don't want a hospital built on a swagger. I want one built on that rare thing you keep under the Maserati keys. Kelvin waited. Humility, Femi said. Kelvin snorted, but the hit landed. What about Tun? Tun wants proof that when pressure comes, you protect, not posture. Femi switched off the lightboard. Win or lose, do it clean. Kelvin nodded once. Clean. As he turned to go, Femi called after him. Kelvin. He looked back. Sometimes, the woman in the waiting room is the only one actually in the room, Femi said. The rest of us? We're busy performing. Kelvin didn't answer. He understood. He found Adora again as evening climbed the walls. Physio had roughed her edges, the kind of fatigue that writes itself at the corner of the mouth, but her eyes were brighter, like someone had cracked a window in a stale room. He matched her energy with deliberate quiet. Physio is a wicked friend, he said. Emphasis on friend, she replied, a ghost of a smile. Wicked only in the moment. May I? He asked, touching the wheelchair handle. At her nod, he steered her toward the same window. The sunset had turned the city to copper. For a while, they watched without talking. My mother used to say Lagos has two moods, Adora said at last. Market and prayer. And this? He asked. Prayer, she said softly. He wanted to ask about her mother. He let it rest. If you could stand anywhere tomorrow, Kelvin said, anywhere in the world, where would it be? She took her time. A kitchen, she said finally. A big one. Pots singing. A radio playing news too loud. Steam on the windows. Someone shouting salt from the other room. He smiled, surprised. Chef. Audience, she replied, a small laugh escaping. I'm good at clapping for other people's genius. Maybe you're genius adjacent, he said. Maybe. Silence again, but companionable. Kelvin checked his watch, then ignored it. Somewhere, an alarm bleeped twice and stilled. He turned the next sentence over like a coin. Heads, tails, risk. There's a cafe 2 blocks down, he said. Not tonight. Another day. They make puff puff at 4 p.m., and the first batch tastes like forgiveness. If you ever want company. She angled her head, not quite suspicious, not quite open. You invite all your patients for puff puff. Only the ones who terrify me, he said lightly, and watched her catch the humor and tuck it away where it might be useful later. I'll think about it, she said. He didn't press. That's more than I deserve. The porter arrived to escort her downstairs. Kelvin stepped aside, made room for the ordinary grace of endings. As she rolled past, Adora looked up at him and, for the first time, allowed something wholly warm into her voice. Good night, Kelvin. He carried the sound of it with him down the corridor like a fragile thing he didn't trust his hands with. Back on the rooftop where it had begun, the city's late hour had turned louder, brasher. Kelvin stood alone at the rail, the night's first smear of cloud flaring under the moon like gauze over a wound. He took his phone out, thumb hovering over a blank note. He typed a single line and saved it under a title that surprised him. Tracker, rules I won't break. No lies. No rush. No rescuing what isn't mine to rescue. No making her a milestone. The list looked like someone else had written it. He pocketed the phone and exhaled. Behind him, the elevator door sighed open. Tun stepped out, hands in pockets. He came to the rail and stood, without speaking, for a full minute. Long enough to honor whatever moment the other man was having. You've decided, Tun said at last. Kelvin nodded. The bed is sealed. And you? Kelvin searched for the right word and found one that tasted honest. Beginning. Tun drew a slow breath and released it. Then here's my only counsel, he said softly. Let the woman remain a person. If she becomes your proof, you'll lose even if you win. Kelvin didn't say I know. He just stood in the Lagos wind and let the advice clutch its place in his chest. Female, Chelsea? Tun asked after a beat. Kelvin's mouth tilted. She'll be beautiful. Inexpensive, Tun muttered, but his smile reached his eyes. He clapped Kelvin once on the shoulder and turned for the elevator. When the doors closed, Kelvin was alone again, with a city that never slept, with a deal that now had teeth, and with the image of a woman by a window who had answered his questions like someone who had survived their own and found, somehow, a reason to still show up. He left the rooftop knowing two things he hadn't known yesterday. The bet was a line on paper. The task ahead was not. And for the first time in a very long time, the Playboy doctor went home feeling less like a swan cutting water and more like a swimmer who had finally decided the ocean deserved his full attention. Far below, the lagoon kept its secrets. Somewhere on the other side of the bridge, a cafe prepared tomorrow's batter. And inside a hospital that hummed like a hive, a woman closed a notebook over a line she would never show him. Different is still standing. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall glass of St. Gregory's atrium, turning the pale marble floor into a quiet canvas of gold and shadow. Dr. Kelvin's day had begun like any other. Early rounds, a post-op check on a hip replacement, a brisk debrief with the surgical interns. But in the back of his mind, the bet hung like a banner he couldn't ignore. He told himself it wasn't about the wager. Not really. It was about curiosity. Adora had a way of sitting in that waiting room, like she was exactly where she wanted to be, not lost, not stranded, not waiting for rescue. It was unsettling in a way Kelvin couldn't explain, because most people who walked into St. Gregory were either seeking something or escaping something. She seemed to be doing neither. Today, she was in her usual spot by the window, a soft teal shawl over her shoulders, the notebook resting open on her lap. Her pen was moving slowly, deliberately, as though each word cost her something to put down. Kelvin slowed his pace, adjusting his white coat, checking his reflection in the chrome edge of the reception desk. Don't rush. Don't make her proof. Just start somewhere. He crossed the waiting room, his footsteps muted on the polished tile. Morning, Adora, he said, letting his voice land with an easy warmth. She looked up, her expression unreadable but not unfriendly. Good morning, Dr. Kelvin. He smiled. Just Kelvin will do. The doctor part makes me feel like I should be holding a stethoscope in every conversation. Her lips curved slightly, the faintest hint of amusement. Maybe you like holding stethoscopes in every conversation. He chuckled. Touché. He nodded toward her notebook. You write a lot. Sometimes, she said, closing it with a quiet snap. When there's something worth writing. Did I make it in yet? He teased. She studied him for a beat. No. The honesty hit him like a quick jab. Unexpected but clean. He leaned on the back of the empty chair beside her. Maybe I'll work on that. Why? She asked simply. It was a fair question, one Kelvin hadn't expected to face this early. Most people accepted his presence like they'd been waiting for it. Adora made him earn the right to stay in the conversation. Because, he said, tilting his head, I think you might have stories worth hearing. Everyone has stories, she replied. Not everyone wants to share them. That's fair. He glanced toward the window. How's the view today? The same as yesterday, she said. And the day before. Lagos doesn't change much from this angle. Kelvin followed her gaze, the constant parade of Okadas weaving through traffic, street vendors balancing baskets of goods, a stray dog curled in a patch of shade. "Maybe the view doesn't change," he said, "but sometimes the way you look at it does." She turned her eyes back to him, measuring him again. "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" Turning casual small talk into whatever this is. He grinned. Occupational hazard. Before he could push further, a nurse in green scrubs approached. "Ms. Adora, physio is ready for you." Adora nodded, lifting her satchel onto her lap. Kelvin instinctively stepped behind the wheelchair, but she paused, looking up at him. "I can get there myself," she said. No edge in her voice, just fact. He raised his hands. "Of course." As she wheeled away, Kelvin caught himself watching her navigate the corridor, steady, practiced, unhurried. It wasn't the movement of someone fragile. It was the movement of someone in control. Later that afternoon, in the staff lounge, Femi was leaning against the counter stirring sugar into his coffee when Kelvin walked in. "How'd it go?" Femi asked, his tone light, but his eyes curious. Kelvin poured water into a glass. "She didn't throw me out." Femi smirked. "High praise." "She's different," Kelvin said slowly. "She doesn't play into anything. No fluster, no fake interest. She answers straight." "That's the point," Femi replied. "If she were like every other woman who chases you down the hallway, this wouldn't be a test." Kelvin gave him a look. "I'm not thinking about it like a test." "Yet," Femi said, taking a sip. The next morning, Kelvin tried a different approach. Adora wasn't in her window seat. She was in the small courtyard behind the east wing, shaded by a jacaranda tree. The sunlight caught faint glints in her hair, and she had a paper cup of tea balanced on her armrest. Kelvin walked up slowly. "I'm starting to think you know all the best corners of this place." She looked over. "There aren't that many corners." He sat on the bench beside her. "Still, you picked a good one." "I like the tree," she said. "It blooms when it wants to. Not when the calendar says it should." He glanced up at the branches, a mix of green and lilac blossoms swaying against the pale sky. "I guess that's one way to live." Adora sipped her tea. "It's the only way to live when the world keeps telling you how you're supposed to." Kelvin let the words settle. There was a gravity to her sentences that made him want to lean closer, but he stayed still. "I feel like you'd be good at winning arguments." "I'm better at ending them," she said. From that day, Kelvin made it a point to find her. Not every day, but often enough to keep the thread unbroken. Sometimes it was a hello in the corridor. Sometimes it was a comment about the weather or a quiet remark about the book she was reading. He never pushed for details, and she never offered more than she wanted to. But slowly, something shifted. She started greeting him first. Her smiles, small and reserved, came a little easier. And once, when he didn't show up for 2 days, she asked him why. "Emergency surgery," he said, leaning against the back of her chair. 3 hours straight. I nearly forgot what sunlight looked like. "Then you should go outside," she said. "Only if you'll come with me," he replied. She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth betrayed the faintest twitch. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Kelvin caught her in the lobby. She was in conversation with the receptionist, her laugh, soft but genuine, catching him off guard. He stepped closer. "Glad to see you're still here," he said. Adora glanced at him. "And where else would I be?" "I can think of a few places," he said. "One of them is better coffee than this building." She tilted her head. "You're persistent." "I'm consistent," he corrected. There was a pause, a flicker of consideration in her eyes. "Then we'll see." That night, Kelvin sat in his apartment, the city lights blinking through the glass walls of his living room. His phone buzzed with messages, friends inviting him out, a string of flirtatious texts from a woman he barely remembered meeting. He ignored them all. On the counter lay a napkin from the hospital cafe. Across it, in careful handwriting, was a single line. "We'll see." He found himself smiling. The bet was still in play, but something in his chest told him this wasn't about the bet anymore. The Friday afternoon rush at St. Gregory was its own kind of chaos. Surgical teams trying to beat shift change, interns scrambling to finish their charts, patients arriving with everything from routine checkups to urgent emergencies. Kelvin had just wrapped up a laparoscopic procedure when his phone buzzed. It was a reminder from the admin board. Charity Health Outreach, St. Gregory Main Auditorium, 5 p.m. He'd forgotten all about it. The hospital hosted quarterly outreach programs, offering free consultations and seminars for underprivileged communities. Usually, he made a brief appearance, shook hands, took the obligatory photo, and left. Today, however, would be different because Adora would be there. When Kelvin arrived at the auditorium, the first thing he noticed was the hum of voices, the shuffle of feet, and the faint smell of jollof rice drifting from the refreshment tables. Rows of plastic chairs were filled with women in bright Ankara wrappers, mothers with restless children, and elderly men leaning on walking sticks. Then he saw her. Adora sat near the front, not in her wheelchair, but in a simple cushioned chair with armrests, a notepad on her lap. She was speaking softly to a young mother holding a baby, her hands gesturing with calm assurance. The mother looked relieved, even grateful, as Adora leaned forward, listening intently. Kelvin stood there for a moment, watching. She wasn't wearing anything particularly extravagant, a cream blouse tucked into a patterned skirt, but she carried herself like she belonged in that room more than anyone else. No trace of the guardedness he often saw in her at the hospital. Here, she looked free. He approached quietly. I didn't know you worked these events, he said as he reached her side. Adora glanced up, smiling faintly. That's because you've never stayed long enough to see anyone except the camera crew. Kelvin grinned, accepting the jab. Fair enough. So what's your role here? Secret coordinator? Volunteer, she said simply. I help translate medical instructions into simpler terms for people who don't speak English well. Sometimes I just listen. He was about to ask more when a voice from the stage called, Ms. Adora, could you please assist with the sign-up sheets? She nodded and began to wheel toward the registration desk. Kelvin instinctively moved to push her chair, but she gave him a side glance. I've got it, right? He said, stepping back. The rest of the afternoon, Kelvin found himself observing. Adora moved from group to group with quiet authority, greeting old faces, holding babies, making jokes with teenagers. She wasn't flashy or loud, but people gravitated toward her like she was a familiar landmark in a busy city. At one point, Kelvin noticed an elderly woman struggling to understand a nurse's instructions about medication timing. Before he could step in, Adora was already there, crouching slightly so she could meet the woman's eyes. She explained the schedule patiently, using the woman's dialect, even drawing little sun and moon symbols on the paper. The woman's tense expression softened into a grateful smile. When Adora returned, Kelvin said, You speak Yoruba and Igbo and a bit of Hausa, she replied. It helps. That's impressive, he said honestly. It's practical, she countered, jotting something in her notepad. If you want people to trust you, you speak in their language. Not just words, but the way you see them. Kelvin tilted his head. You make a great doctor. She gave him a small smile. I'd make a terrible one. Too impatient with paperwork. As the event wound down, Kelvin offered to walk her to the exit. This time she didn't refuse, and he rolled her chair beside him through the now empty corridor. You're not the person I thought you were, he said after a pause. She glanced at him. And who did you think I was? Someone who stayed in one place. Who just existed in the hospital because she had to. Adora's expression was unreadable. People assume a lot when they don't know the whole story. I'd like to, Kelvin said quietly. She stopped in front of the elevator, turning slightly to face him. Stories are earned, Kelvin, not collected. The following week, Kelvin saw her again, but this time outside the hospital entirely. He had gone to a small bakery near Lekki for a quick breakfast between surgeries, and there she was, at a corner table by the window, sipping tea. A tote bag hung from her chair, filled with what looked like fabric swatches. He walked over. I thought you only haunted hospitals. Adora raised a brow. And I thought you only existed in operating rooms and rooftop bars. He laughed, taking the seat across from her, without waiting for an invitation. Fair point. What's in the bag? Work, she said. What kind of work? Textiles. I do a bit of custom fabric sourcing for designers. Kelvin blinked. That's unexpected. You're not the only one with layers, Kelvin, she said, sipping her tea. They talked for nearly half an hour, about the best puff stalls in Lagos, her favorite old Nollywood films, his disastrous attempt to cook a goosey in med school. It was easy in a way he hadn't expected, the conversation slipping between teasing and sincerity without effort. When they parted, she surprised him with, "Thanks for breakfast." He grinned. "You didn't let me pay." "I didn't say you bought it," she replied, wheeling toward the door. Kelvin sat there for a while after she left, wondering how a woman he barely knew could leave him feeling like he'd just stepped out of a room he wanted to re-enter immediately. That night, Kelvin sent Femi a brief message. "She's not who he thought." Femi replied, "Good. Makes it interesting." Kelvin stared at the screen, then set the phone down. The bet still loomed in the background, but it was starting to feel less like a finish line and more like an irrelevant scoreboard. And that was dangerous. The rain had been falling since dawn, steady and deliberate, turning the hospital courtyard into a mosaic of rippling puddles. Most people hurried past the windows without looking, shoulders hunched under umbrellas. Kelvin, however, paused on the second-floor walkway, hands resting on the cool steel railing, watching the drops race each other down the glass. He didn't know why the weather made him think of Adora. Maybe because she struck him the same way, calm on the surface, but with something steady and unrelenting beneath. He had checked the physio schedule earlier and knew she'd be free by noon. He told himself it wasn't stalking. He just didn't want to accidentally miss her. By the time he reached the waiting area, she was there, a light gray sweater over her blouse, the teal shawl draped neatly over the back of her wheelchair. She was staring out at the rain, a half-finished cup of tea on the table beside her. "Gray suits you," Kelvin said as he walked up, his voice low enough not to startle her. Adora looked over, raising a brow. "It's a sweater, not a ball gown." "Still," he said, pulling out a chair beside her, "you make it work." She didn't blush or thank him, just returned her gaze to the rain. "You like watching weather?" "Sometimes," he said. "Reminds me I'm not in control of everything." That's a surprising admission for a surgeon. Kelvin grinned faintly. "I never said I liked it." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the rain. Then, Kelvin leaned forward. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends," Adora said without looking at him. On whether it's actually personal to me, or just your curiosity." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But this one is both." She finally turned toward him, eyes steady. "Ask, what's kept you coming to St. Gregory for so long? I've seen you here more than some of the junior doctors." Adora studied his face, as though weighing his sincerity. "Multiple surgeries," she said at last, "and follow-up care." Kelvin nodded slowly, his expression open. "That explains some things." "Some," she echoed. He hesitated, then asked, "Are you still in treatment?" Adora didn't flinch. "Not the kind you're thinking of. I'm living with the results now. Adjusting. That's the part no one prepares you for." Kelvin's usual banter faltered. There was no place for clever lines here. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She tilted her head. "Why? You didn't cause it." "No," he admitted, "but I know what it's like to see someone's life change in a single moment, and to know it won't go back." Adora's gaze softened slightly. "That's the part most people don't get. They think recovery means going back to before. It doesn't. It means finding a new after." For a long moment, Kelvin just looked at her, really looked. The faint scars tracing her jaw, the way her hands rested on the armrest with a mix of strength and reserve. She wasn't fragile. She was rebuilt. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She raised a brow. "I thought you already were." He smiled, but there was a rare earnestness in his tone. "I've seen a lot of people give up when life changes the rules. But you sit here like someone who refuses to fold." Adora's lips curved slightly. "That's because I don't have the luxury of folding. People think resilience is a choice. Sometimes it's just the only option left." Kelvin leaned back, his respect for her deepening in a way that had nothing to do with the bet. "Then maybe that's what I like about you." "Careful," she said lightly. "That sounds like flattery." "It's observation," he replied. The rain eased to a drizzle, and a pale light filtered into the waiting area. Adora glanced at the clock. "I should head home before the roads flood." Kelvin stood, instinctively moving to her chair, then catching himself. "Want to walk you out?" She gave him that unreadable look again. "You can walk beside me." He grinned. "I'll take it." They made their way toward the entrance, their pace unhurried. Kelvin asked about the book she'd been reading last week, and she teased him for forgetting the author's name. By the time they reached the taxi stand, there was a lightness between them that hadn't been there before. As the driver loaded her chair into the trunk, Kelvin leaned on the open car door. "Coffee sometime?" Adora didn't answer right away. Then, with a small smirk, she said, "We'll see." The door closed, and the taxi pulled away, leaving Kelvin standing in the damp air with the kind of smile he didn't realize he was wearing until a nurse passed and raised an eyebrow at him. That night, Kelvin didn't go to the rooftop bar his friends were at. Instead, he sat in his apartment with the city stretching out below and thought about Adora's words, finding a new after. The bet was still in place, but for the first time, he wondered if winning it on paper would matter as much as winning something else entirely. By the time October rolled in, the air in Lagos carried that subtle shift, still warm, but with a crisp edge in the mornings that hinted at the year's slow descent toward Harmattan. At St. Gregory, it meant fewer air conditioners running at full blast and more open windows in the general wards. For Kelvin, it meant something else entirely. It meant that somehow, without planning it, Adora had become a fixture in his week. Not every day. He didn't want to smother her, but often enough that when she wasn't there, he noticed the absence like a missing note in a familiar song. It wasn't grand gestures. It was little things. Bringing her the hospital cafe's one decent cinnamon roll before they sold out. Carrying her satchel when it was obviously heavier than she claimed. Asking about her textile work and actually remembering the names of the designers she mentioned. And then there were the conversations, sometimes deep, sometimes laughably trivial. They had once debated for 20 minutes about whether Puff Puff should be eaten plain or with a sprinkle of powdered sugar. "You don't tamper with perfection," Adora had insisted. "Sugar makes it better," Kelvin had countered. The argument was unresolved. One Thursday, he found her in the East Courtyard again, sketching patterns in her notebook. "Tell me you're finally designing something for me," Kelvin said as he sat on the bench. "Not unless you plan on wearing a wrapper to surgery," she replied without looking up. He grinned. "I'd rock it." "You'd scandalize your patients," she said, her lips twitching. Kelvin leaned back, watching her pencil move. "Why textiles?" Adora shrugged. "They tell stories without words. Every pattern means something to someone. You just have to know how to read it." He found himself staring at her longer than he should. "I'm starting to think you read people the same way." She paused, meeting his gaze. "Maybe." Then, after a beat, "And maybe I'm not telling you the story you think you're reading." That evening, Kelvin's friends noticed a shift. They were at Femi's apartment, finalizing equipment supplier bids for female Chelsea, when Tund looked over his laptop and asked, "So, how's your project?" Kelvin shot him a look. "Don't call her that." Femi raised an eyebrow. "Touchy. Sounds like someone's forgetting the point." "I'm not forgetting," Kelvin said evenly. "I'm just seeing more than I thought I would." "Seeing more?" Femi repeated, smirking. "That's how it starts." Kelvin ignored him, but later that night, lying in bed, the words lingered. Was he still playing to win the bet? Or had the bet become irrelevant? The answer edged closer a week later. It was a Saturday, and Kelvin was on his way out of the hospital when he spotted Adora near the pediatrics wing. She was crouched slightly, speaking to a little girl in a bright yellow dress who clutched a stuffed rabbit. The girl's mother stood nearby, eyes weary. Kelvin walked over just as Adora handed the girl a folded paper crane. The child's eyes lit up. "It's magic," she whispered. "No," Adora said softly. "It's just paper that remembers how to be something else." Kelvin's chest tightened unexpectedly. After the girl and her mother left, he asked, "Paper cranes? Really?" Adora smiled. "It distracts them during long waits. My hands like to stay busy." "I think you just like leaving magic behind," he said. "Maybe," she replied, wheeling toward the elevator. "It's better than leaving nothing." That afternoon, he took her up on something they'd joked about weeks ago. "Puff Puff run?" he asked, appearing in the waiting room with 2 takeaway cups of coffee. She considered it, then nodded. "Let's go." They ended up at a small roadside cafe 2 blocks away, the kind of place where the oil from the fryer scented the air before you even reached the door. The first batch was fresh, warm enough to burn fingers if you weren't careful. Kelvin bit into one and closed his eyes. Forgiveness, he murmured. Told you, Adora said, smiling over her cup. They lingered long after the plate was empty, talking about everything from favorite childhood meals to the oddest patients Kelvin had ever treated. He left out names and specifics, of course. At one point, Adora looked at him and said, You're different when you're not in your scrubs. Better or worse? Just different, she said. Less like you're trying to prove something. Back at the hospital entrance, Kelvin hesitated before saying goodbye. You know, he said, we could do this again. Adora raised an eyebrow. Eat fried dough and coffee until we regret our life choices. Exactly, he said with a grin. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. That night, Kelvin opened the note on his phone, the one titled Tracker, Rules I Won't Break. He read through the list, then added a new line at the bottom. 5. Don't forget why I started. The rooftop of Skyline Lounge was buzzing with weekend energy, Afrobeats pulsing from hidden speakers, the city skyline flickering in neon and warm streetlight. Kelvin sat at a corner table with Femi and Tund, their plates scattered with the remnants of suya and grilled plantain. On most nights, their conversations flowed easily, sports banter, surgical gossip, a shared toast to some ridiculous patient anecdote. Tonight, though, the air had a different weight. So, Femi began, swirling the ice in his glass. How's the outreach? Kelvin looked up from his phone. Outreach? You know, Femi said casually, your community service project in the waiting room. Kelvin's jaw tightened. You make it sound like I'm picking up a side hustle. Tun leaned forward, elbows on the table. We're just checking in. We agreed to this bet because we thought you could handle it without losing perspective. Kelvin arched a brow. And what's that supposed to mean? It means, Femi said, the last 3 times we've needed your input on female Chelsea, you were unavailable. And Tund here swears he saw you leaving the hospital cafe with her the other day, laughing like you didn't have a care in the world. Kelvin's eyes narrowed. So I can't laugh now? That's not the point, Tund said evenly. The point is you look invested. Kelvin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. You wanted me to win her over. I'm doing that. Yeah, but the plan was to win her over, Femi said, not fall in love like some Nollywood lead who forgets the script halfway. Kelvin said nothing, his gaze drifting to the Lagos skyline. Femi smirked. You see? You're not even denying it. I'm not confirming it either, Kelvin replied. I'm just talking to her, getting to know her. Tun studied him. And if you're being honest with yourself, does the equity matter as much now as it did when we made the deal? Kelvin hesitated. It matters. Just maybe not the same way. Femi let out a low whistle. This is exactly how it starts. 2 days later, Kelvin was in the staff lounge when he overheard 2 nurses talking near the vending machine. She's always with him now, one said in Yoruba, thinking Kelvin couldn't hear. That woman in the wheelchair. Have you noticed? I have, the other replied. Maybe it's a charity thing. You know Kelvin. He likes to look good. Kelvin's grip tightened on his coffee cup. Charity. The word stung more than it should have. That afternoon, he found Adora in the courtyard, sketching again. He sat beside her without a word, letting the quiet stretch between them. You look distracted, she said at last. Just hospital politics, he replied. Her pencil didn't stop moving. Do they ever stop? Not really, he said, especially when people think they know your motives. Adora glanced at him. And do they? Kelvin met her gaze. Not always. That evening, he messaged Femi. We need to talk about boundaries. The reply came fast. Yours or hers? Kelvin didn't respond. The tension came to a head at their next planning meeting. In the conference room above Tun's private clinic, blueprints for female Chelsea were spread across the table. We need your final approval on the rehab wing, Tun said, pointing to the layout. Kelvin scanned it. Looks fine. Fine. Femi scoffed. That's all you've got? You used to pick apart every detail like you were designing the place yourself. I trust you guys, Kelvin said, closing the folder. No, Femi said flatly. You're distracted. And if this bet is going to mean anything, you need to remember the goal. You think she's going to just what? Fall for you and make everything simple. Kelvin's eyes hardened. Maybe I'm starting to care whether she does, for the right reasons. Ton sat back, expression unreadable. Then you'd better figure out which game you're playing, Kelvin, because you can't win both. That night, Kelvin returned to his apartment and opened the note on his phone, the one with the tracker, rules I won't break. He read them over, his thumb hovering above the screen. He didn't add a new rule. He didn't delete any either. Instead, he closed the phone and stared out at the city lights, wondering if the line between the bet and something real had already vanished without him noticing. The city was restless that Friday night, traffic horns clashing with the hum of generators, the faint bass of street parties drifting into the Lagos sky. Kelvin sat at the far end of his apartment's balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out over the rooftops. His friend's word from last week still echoed in his head. You can't win both. The bet had been clean on paper. Get her to fall for him. Marry her. 3 months. 40% share in female Chelsea. But somewhere along the way, the script had blurred. The pursuit no longer felt like a strategy. It felt like something he didn't want to end. And that was the problem. He'd been thinking about this for days. How to get ahead of the inevitable fallout. If Adora found out about the wager from someone else, it would destroy everything. If he told her himself, maybe, just maybe, she'd see the truth beneath it. The decision settled in his chest like a stone. He would tell her, and he'd do it in a way that didn't feel like a confession in a hospital corridor. It had to be deliberate. It had to be on his terms. It had to be at the moment he asked her to marry him. The next morning, Kelvin called in a favor from an old patient, a restaurateur who owed him more than one courtesy. The plan was simple but precise. Private dining room, soft lighting, live violin, a menu curated to Adora's tastes. The timing had to be perfect, and so did the guest list. This was not going to be just him and Adora. It was going to be him, Adora, and the 2 friends who had set this entire wager into motion. Are you sure you want us there? Femi asked when Kelvin told them. Yes, Kelvin said. I'm going to tell her about the bet in front of you. No secrets. No room for someone to twist it later. Ton studied him. And if she walks out? Kelvin's voice didn't waver. Then she walks out knowing I didn't hide. The week leading up to the dinner, Kelvin saw Adora twice. Once in the courtyard and once during her physio session. He didn't hint at what was coming. He didn't change his rhythm. If anything, he was gentler with her, more present in their small conversations. She noticed. You're quieter lately, she said one afternoon as they watched the jacaranda petals fall. Thinking, he replied. About? He gave her a half-smile. You'll find out soon. The evening of the proposal, Kelvin arrived at the restaurant an hour early. The private room glowed with warm gold light. The table set for 4 with delicate white china and tall wine glasses. He checked the positioning of the violinist, the placement of the small velvet box in his jacket pocket, the chilled bottle of sparkling cider, Adora's favorite. She didn't drink alcohol. At exactly 7:15, Femi and Ton walked in. Last chance to back out, Femi murmured. Not backing out, Kelvin said. When Adora arrived at 7:30, she was wearing a deep emerald dress that seemed to pull the light toward her. Her hair was styled in a low twist, and the only jewelry she wore was a thin silver chain. You look breathtaking, Kelvin said honestly. She gave him a small smile. You clean up well yourself. When she noticed Femi and Ton, her brows lifted. I didn't realize this was a group dinner. Kelvin pulled out her chair. Tonight's a little different. The first course was served, roasted plantain with a light pepper sauce, and the conversation was polite, if cautious. Adora asked about the progress on female Chelsea. Ton gave a measured update, while Femi threw in a few teasing remarks. By the time the main course arrived, Kelvin knew it was time. He reached into his jacket and placed the small velvet box on the table. Adora's eyes widened slightly, but before she could speak, he raised a hand. There's something I need to tell you first, he said. The room seemed to still. Even the violinist's bow slowed on the strings. When I first started talking to you, Kelvin began, it wasn't purely out of chance. Femi tunned, and I made a bet. If I could win your heart, marry you, even for just 3 months, I get a larger share in female Chelsea. 40%. They thought you'd see through me immediately, that you'd never let me close enough. He saw the flicker in her eyes. Not shock, but something else. But somewhere along the way, Kelvin continued, the bet stopped being the point. I'm telling you this now because I can't ask you to marry me without you knowing exactly how it started. And if this ends here, I'll accept that. But I had to tell you myself. He slid the box toward her and opened it. Inside was a simple, elegant ring. Adora, will you marry me? For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then Adora looked at him, really looked at him, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. I already knew, she said. Kelvin blinked. You what? I knew about the bet from the start, she said calmly. People talk, Kelvin, especially in hospitals, but I decided to let you play it out. His throat felt tight. Why? Because I wanted to see what you'd do when you realized I wasn't a prize to be won. She paused, her gaze steady. And because you deserve to know something about me, too. She glanced briefly at Femi and Tund, then back at Kelvin. I own St. Gregory Medical Center. Majority shares. Silent partner. This hospital you work in, the one you walk through every day, it's mine. Kelvin's heartbeat stumbled. Adora reached for the ring box and closed it gently. And yes, Kelvin, I'll take the ring. But if this is going to work, we're going to take our time, 3 months, maybe more, to come to terms with what we really are to each other now. She slid the box in her bag. You've won me, but the bet? That's between you and your friends. Femi and Tund exchanged a glance. Kelvin could see the verdict in their eyes before they spoke. Null and void, Femi said simply. She knew from the start. Kelvin didn't look away from Adora. Doesn't matter. And for the first time since this wager began, he meant it. The ride back from the restaurant was quiet, but not with the heavy, suffocating kind of silence Kelvin had feared. It was reflective. Adora sat beside him in the back of the car, her fingers absently tracing the velvet surface of the ring box in her lap. Outside, Lagos moved in its usual rhythm, street hawkers weaving between cars, the neon lights of Suya stands flashing in the humid night air. But inside, the world felt slowed, like they were both still digesting what had just happened. Kelvin kept his eyes forward, one hand draped loosely over his knee, the other resting near hers but not quite touching. He wanted to speak, to explain more, to close the gap, but something told him she needed space to process on her own. When they pulled up in front of her apartment, the driver waited as Kelvin got out and moved to open her door. She met his gaze briefly before letting him help her down in her wheelchair. Thank you for the evening, she said, her tone neutral but not cold. Thank you for not walking, well, rolling out, Kelvin replied with a small smile. A faint flicker of amusement crossed her face, but it faded quickly. We'll talk soon. He nodded, resisting the urge to push. Good night, Adora. Good night, Kelvin. Back in his apartment, Kelvin poured himself a drink and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city. The echo of her words from dinner kept replaying. I own St. Gregory Medical Center. He had imagined telling her the truth would shift the power between them, but hadn't just shifted, it had flipped. She had been holding the ace all along. His phone buzzed. A message from Tund. We'll talk tomorrow. Another from Femi. You're lucky she didn't end it right there. Kelvin tossed the phone on the couch. Lucky? Maybe. Or maybe Adora had decided the game wasn't over. The next few days at the hospital felt different. When Kelvin saw Adora in the courtyard, she didn't ignore him, but she didn't linger either. Their exchanges were polite, brief, like colleagues passing in a corridor. It was as if the intimacy they had been building had been put on pause, pending some unspoken review. On the third day, he found her in the physiotherapy room, watching another patient work through a set of exercises. Hi, he said quietly. She looked over, gave a small nod. Kelvin. He waited until the physio session ended before stepping closer. I don't want to crowd you, but I meant everything I said the other night. The bet might have been how this started, but it's not why I'm still here. Adora studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then show me. Don't tell me. We have 3 months. Let's see what you do with them. It was the first clear directive she'd given him since the proposal, and Kelvin took it seriously. The next week, he began making changes. Not grand gestures at first. Those could feel hollow. Instead, he focused on the small, consistent things that mattered. Adjusting his schedule so he could walk her to her car after physio. bringing her fabric samples from his travels to different parts of the city, sitting with her at lunch without checking his phone once. He also began showing up for hospital initiatives that didn't have his name attached to them. The free maternity clinics, the health talks in local markets, the behind-the-scenes meetings where Adora quietly observed more than she spoke. But he wasn't the only one adjusting. Kelvin began noticing moments when Adaora's guard seemed to slip. The way her smile lingered a little longer during their conversations, the occasional teasing remark, the fact that she once let him push her wheelchair without protest when they were running late for a meeting. One afternoon, as they left the hospital, she asked, "What would you have done if I'd said no that night?" Kelvin glanced at her, kept trying. She smirked. "That sounds like a line." "It's the truth," he said. "The bet might have ended, but I wouldn't have." Word about their engagement began to ripple through the hospital, partly because of gossip, partly because of the fact that Adora wasn't hiding it. She didn't flaunt the ring, but she didn't remove it either. One day in the cafeteria, a nurse congratulated her. Adora thanked her with a polite smile, then glanced at Kelvin across the room. For a fleeting moment, her expression softened, and Kelvin caught it. Not everyone was thrilled. Kelvin's friends stayed cool but distant. Femi in particular couldn't hide his irritation. "You realize you voided the bet and tanked your share, right?" he said one evening in the parking lot. Kelvin shrugged. "So be it. You're willing to throw away millions because you like how she makes you feel?" Kelvin met his gaze. "I'm willing to throw away millions because I don't want to lose her." The first month passed like that. Steady, deliberate, almost like a slow dance. By the end of it, Kelvin noticed the way Adaora's eyes searched for him in a crowd, the way she began to initiate some of their conversations. One evening, they ended up in the hospital courtyard after hours, the jacaranda tree casting long shadows in the moonlight. Kelvin handed her a paper cup of tea and sat beside her. "You've changed," Adora said suddenly. "In a good way?" he asked. "In a real way," she replied. "That's the only kind that matters." Kelvin felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear this time, but the quiet realization that this was working. Not the bet. By the start of the second month, Kelvin understood something that had eluded him for years. Proving love wasn't about one grand gesture. It was about the sum of 100 small, deliberate choices. Adaora's quiet test was forcing him to show up in ways he never had for anyone. And she noticed. The first big shift came on a Wednesday morning. The hospital board meeting was in full swing, a tense discussion about budgets and equipment allocations, when Kelvin surprised everyone by siding with Adora on a proposal to expand the free postnatal care program. The CFO protested, citing costs. Kelvin countered with figures he had personally gathered from other hospitals. "If we can keep new mothers healthy, we reduce emergency readmissions and long-term costs. It's not charity, it's smart medicine," he said firmly. Adora didn't speak during his defense, but when the vote passed in her favor, her eyes found his across the table. It wasn't a smile. It was something quieter, approval. That weekend, he took another step. He canceled a lucrative private surgery appointment, the kind he normally prioritized, to attend a textile fair with her. "I didn't ask you to come," Adora said as they entered the buzzing hall, bolts of fabric stacked high in every direction. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." She quizzed him mercilessly on fabric types. Ankara, Aso, Oak, Adire, and laughed when he confused two patterns. For the first time, he saw her outside the hospital in her element, greeting vendors by name, negotiating prices with an ease that made him realize how much of her world he hadn't touched. At one stall, she handed him a length of deep indigo Adire. "Hold this up," she said. He did, awkwardly. "Too short for you," she murmured, eyes glinting. "But it might make a decent pillowcase." He laughed. "Remind me never to take fashion advice from you." 2 weeks later, Kelvin organized something that surprised even himself. Using his contacts in the hospital network, he arranged a community outreach program in Ajagunal, complete with mobile clinics, free checkups, and a mini fabric workshop led by Adora herself. She had tried to refuse at first. "I don't want to be paraded like a project," she said. "This isn't about that," he told her. "It's about showing people the skills you have, and how they can create something of their own. On the day of the event, Kelvin stayed in the background while she taught, watching her explain folding and dyeing techniques to a group of teenage girls. Her voice was animated, her smile wide. When one girl managed a perfect fold, Adora clapped like a proud teacher. Later, in the car, she turned to him. "You planned this well." He shrugged. I listened. By the middle of the third month, their relationship had shifted again. The guarded politeness was gone. She still kept her boundaries. She always would, but there was a warmth in her tone now, a willingness to share parts of her life she had kept sealed. One evening, she told him about the accident that had led to her surgeries. "It wasn't dramatic," she said quietly. "A car clipped me while I was crossing the street. Small injury at first, or so I thought. Then came the infections, the complications, and years later, here we are." Kelvin listened without interrupting, his hands still on the coffee cup between them. "I'm sorry you went through that." She shook her head. "Don't be. It made me who I am. It taught me to cut through nonsense fast." He smiled faintly. "Guess I should be grateful, then. You cut through mine." As the 3 months drew to a close, Kelvin realized he hadn't thought about the bet in weeks. His friends barely brought it up anymore, perhaps because they could see the answer written all over him. On the last evening of the trial, he invited Adora to the hospital rooftop just after sunset. The city stretched out beneath them, bathed in a golden-orange glow. "I don't know if I've done enough," Kelvin admitted, leaning on the railing. Adora looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Enough for what?" "For you to believe me." She was quiet for a long moment. "Belief isn't built in months, Kelvin. But I believe you're trying, and that matters more than where we started." That night, she didn't just say good night at the hospital gate. She let him drive her home, and when he helped her out of the car, she rested her hand on his for just a second longer than necessary. 3 months are up," she said softly. Kelvin met her gaze. "Then let's start the next 3. The call came on a Tuesday evening. Kelvin had just finished reviewing post-op notes in his office when his phone lit up with Femi's name. "You free to meet tonight?" Femi asked. "Depends on what it's about," Kelvin replied, already sensing the direction. "It's about the deal," Femi said, "and the fact that we've reached the end of the 3 months. They met at the same rooftop lounge where this whole thing had started. The Lego skyline was draped in the purple haze of early evening, and the hum of the city felt strangely in sync with the tension between them. Tun was already there, nursing a drink. Kelvin slid into the empty seat. "All right, let's hear it." Femi didn't waste time. "You know the terms. Win her heart, marry her for at least 3 months, and the 40% is yours." But Adora knew about the bet from the start. "That nullifies the original conditions." Kelvin leaned back in his chair. "You're telling me something I already know." "This isn't personal," Tun said carefully. "It's contractual. The premise was that she'd have no idea, that you'd be starting from zero." The moment she knew, it became a different game. Femi's tone was sharper. "And if you're honest, you stopped playing the game a long time ago." Kelvin met his gaze. "Yeah, because it stopped being about the game." They let that hang in the air for a moment, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from other tables filling the space. "So," Femi said finally, "your equity stays at 30%. That's our decision." Kelvin took a slow sip of his drink. "Fine." Femi frowned. "That's it? No argument? No fight? What would I be fighting for?" Kelvin said, "A bigger slice of a hospital I already have a stake in? You think that's worth more than what I have with her now?" Tun's eyes softened. "You're serious about her." "More than I've ever been about anything," Kelvin said quietly. Femi leaned back, studying him. "You realize most men in your position wouldn't have chosen this way, right?" Kelvin gave a small shrug. "Most men aren't me, and I'm glad of it." Tun smiled faintly. "Then I guess we wish you luck." When Kelvin left the lounge that night, he didn't feel like a man who'd lost. In fact, he felt lighter. The deal, the percentages, the endless calculations, all of it had been noise. The real work was happening somewhere else entirely, in small, quiet moments with a woman who had seen through him and stayed anyway. The next day, Kelvin found Adora in the courtyard, her hands folded over her lap as she watched the jacaranda blossoms fall. "They voided the bet," he said as he sat beside her. She looked at him, tilting her head slightly. And I don't care." Adaora's lips curved. Good, because I wouldn't want to be part of anyone's transaction. He smiled. You never were. For the first time, she didn't deflect. She reached over and rested her hand lightly over his. 3 months of you proving yourself. Maybe it's time to see what comes next. Kelvin didn't answer with words. He simply covered her hand with his own and sat with her under the shade of the jacaranda, letting the petals fall around them like the soft punctuation of a chapter ending and another beginning. The church courtyard was awash in the late morning sun, the kind that painted everything in soft gold and carried the scent of fresh flowers. Guests were arriving in a flurry of ankara, lace, and head wraps, laughter and music mingling in the warm air. Inside, the sound of the organ drifted toward the open doors, a gentle prelude to what was about to begin. Kelvin stood at the front of the aisle in a tailored cream agbada, the subtle embroidery catching the light. His friends, Femi and Tund, were beside him, both in matching earth tones. They hadn't spoken much about the bed in the past month, but today wasn't about that. It was about something far more lasting. Kelvin wasn't nervous about the vows. He wasn't worried about the crowd. What quickened his heartbeat was the moment he'd see her, the woman who had dismantled every assumption he'd had about himself and rebuilt him into something better. The murmur in the room softened as the doors opened. Adora appeared, not in the traditional white gown, but in a flowing gold and ivory ensemble that shimmered with each turn of the fabric. The dress was designed to fall elegantly over her wheelchair, the skirt cascading like water to the floor. Her hair was styled in a low, intricate bun, adorned with delicate gold pins. For a heartbeat, Kelvin forgot there was anyone else in the room. She wheeled slowly down the aisle, her eyes fixed on his, the faintest smile on her lips. Every step, or roll, she took toward him felt like the closing of a gap that had existed far longer than 3 months. When she reached the front, he stepped forward, took her hand, and whispered, "You're stunning." Adaora's smile deepened. "You clean up all right yourself." The officiant began the ceremony, but Kelvin barely registered the words until it was time for the vows. They had chosen to write their own. Kelvin's voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of the past months. "Adora, I met you thinking I knew what winning meant. That was about convincing, persuading, closing the deal. But you showed me that love isn't something you take, it's something you earn over time with truth and with care. I don't care about percentages or wagers. I care about waking up and knowing I have you to fight for every day for the rest of my life." Adaora's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. Her voice was warm, deliberate. "Kelvin, I knew from the start what you were after, and I also knew you'd have to decide if I was worth more than a bet. You've shown me that you can be more than the man you were, and you've done it without asking for shortcuts. I'm not promising you a perfect life, but I'm promising you a life where we don't run from the truth, no matter how it finds us." When the rings were exchanged, Kelvin slid the simple gold band onto her finger, his hand steady. Adora did the same, her touch lingering just long enough for him to know she meant every word she had said. "By the power vested in me," the officiant declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Kelvin leaned down and kissed her, not with the urgency of someone trying to claim a prize, but with the certainty of someone sealing a promise. The reception was held in a sunlit garden behind the church. Long tables were draped with white linens, the centerpieces a mix of fresh flowers and bolts of patterned fabric in Adaora's signature colors. The air was filled with the smell of grilled fish, jollof rice, and puff puff, Adaora's idea. At one point, Tund pulled Kelvin aside. "You lost the bet," he said simply. Kelvin smiled. "Best loss of my life." Femi shook his head, but there was no edge in his voice when he said, "You know, I think you actually won something bigger." Kelvin glanced across the garden, where Adora was laughing with a group of her friends, sunlight catching in her hair. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." As the day wound down and the last of the guests began to leave, Kelvin wheeled Adora to the quiet edge of the garden, away from the music and the chatter. "3 months ago," he said, "you told me we'd take our time. I didn't know then how much I needed that. I still don't know how I got lucky enough for you to say yes." Adora looked up at him. It wasn't luck, Kelvin. It was choice. Yours and mine. He squeezed her hand. Then let's keep choosing each other. And as the evening light settled over them, it was clear to both of them that the story that had begun as a wager had become something far rarer, a love neither of them had expected, but both of them knew they'd keep.